Hi there, welcome everyone. My name is Victor Hadenberg. I'm the membership director at AMBA and BGA, and I'm very excited to welcome our guest for today's session, who is Dr. Greg Chasson. Greg is a distinguished, licensed, and board certified clinical psychologist and cognitive behavioral therapist, researcher, and educator. He's an associate professor at the University of Chicago in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Neuroscience, where he's also the director of behavioral interventions of the Obsessive Compulsive and Related Disorders Clinic. He's the author of Flawed: Why Perfectionism is a Challenge for Management. Dr. Chasson earned his BA in psychology from the University of California at Santa Barbara and his PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Houston. His professional journey led him through 3 transformative years at Harvard Medical School, including a prestigious internship at McLean Hospital and postdoctoral clinical and research fellowship at Massachusetts General Hospital. And what we will be doing today really is exploring the complexities of perfectionism, including its impact on productivity and workplace culture. And I'm sure our audience, of which many are currently MBAs or have completed MBAs, know perhaps the pressures of perfectionism and what it has actually in terms of impact on work. So, Greg, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Good, good. So why don't we start very quickly, Greg, about you giving us a little bit of a background as to what made you interested in psychology, first of all, and what led you down this path?
Yeah, I mean, my interest in psychology goes far back. I was in high school, and my grandfather was a therapist in Hollywood, California. And so he had quite a lot of stories, of course, anonymized because you can't really talk about who you were treating at the time. But when he passed away in the 90s, he left behind a treasure trove of cool things like the Minnesota multiphasic inventory, some of the original Freud texts, some Rorschachs, some really interesting tools and things that a young teenager who's thinking about what he wants to do with his life kind of fell into and became fascinated with this concept of understanding human psychology, human behavior. And so, unlike a lot of people of that age, I kind of knew what I wanted to do early on and set out on that course. And as a result, really got myself immersed in that as an undergraduate and pursued a higher degree, an advanced degree in clinical psychology. My original area of interest was in the autism spectrum. It's an area that I still am, interested in. But really, once I got to grad school, I treated it a little bit like a buffet and dabbled in this, tried a little bit of that, went back for seconds and thirds, and ended up falling in love with the obsessive compulsive disorder and related conditions family, where I've since really, set my sights and developed a niche in that area. And perfectionism falls into that category. Now, not everyone with perfectionism has OCD, and not everyone with OCD has perfectionism, but obsessive compulsive disorder and perfectionism have a lot of similarities. If you look at a Venn diagram of those two, there's quite a lot of overlap. And so, as my journey in the world of OCD and treatment development and research, it led me on this path of also being quite interested in perfectionism. And not to, spoiler alert, I've also had my own journey with perfectionism. And I think that has played a large role in my gravitating toward this topic and drawing on the lessons that I've learned both professionally and personally. And so that culminated about a year ago when my trainees at the University of Chicago, where we provide treatment for severe cases of perfectionism, and where perfectionism is quite common. University of Chicago is an elite institution, and we tend to attract a certain type of a student. And so we
Mhm.
see it all the time coming into my clinic, people who are really struggling. I have it coming out of my ears, as they say. And my students who have seen me work with this, and I've sort of a model and based on research and clinical, I've said, you need to write a book about this, man. And I was like, oh, I never really thought about that. And they said, you need to write a book about this, not just for people who are struggling with severe perfectionism, but your ideas extend to the masses in terms of helping people who are in different environments. And As I was thinking about perfectionism, it occurred to me that there's really not a lot of good resources out there for people in the work setting, people who are in leadership roles, people struggling with their own perfectionism, but more importantly, how do you deal with people in the work
Mhm.
environment that get stuck on this? How do you create a culture that doesn't foster perfectionism, but instead leverages strengths that might come with it, but also reduces all of the damage that might come from it as well. And I'm happy to talk about both the strengths and the damage as we move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, why don't we go straight into your book? Because this is quite interesting. Perfectionism is usually misunderstood as a really good quality. In fact, I'm sure that many of our MBAs and graduates who have their MBAs, they are of the idea that the closer you are to perfection, the better. And so this is a good quality. But why do you think it has this reputation? And what are some of the common misconceptions people have around this concept?
Yeah, I'm happy to discuss that because I do think it's a common trope for someone to answer the question, what is your greatest weakness? With, oh, well, of course, I'm a perfectionist. I just can't stop doing quality work. And,
Right.
the interviewer rolls their eyes and goes, uh-huh, tell me a real weakness. But in reality, if you truly are appreciating the concept of perfectionism, that's an answer that really is a loaded answer. And when someone says that to me when I'm hiring, little do they know that that's an area of my expertise. So I kind of have a little bit of a cringe in my body. But perfectionism is it's a loaded term and it's a mixed bag. It comes with tremendous positive strengths. Those strengths include things like loyalty and honesty and being detailed oriented and being conscientious. I mean, if there's one thing I would want in an employee, it's conscientiousness. That's a key ingredient for your best employees. But it's really those positive qualities are not necessary for working on reducing perfectionism. You can have all those great qualities and reduce the damage that perfectionism causes at the same time. And perfectionism has plenty of those. I would say the cons often outweigh the pros. And so that's the point of this book is how can you leverage some of those strengths while eliminating or reducing some of the damage that occurs?
So, what would be then some of those characteristics of perfectionism? Can you explain the impact of the characteristics on a person's day-to-day decision making and well-being, actually?
Absolutely. So perfectionism really is defined by two core features that I think are uh, crucial for thinking about this, because it's not the same thing as having high standards. I want to make that
Mhm.
very clear. Perfectionism is about cognitive rigidity or being inflexible in your thinking, being unable to pivot, being able to adapt to and to take on new mindsets when the data are in front of you that suggests that it's time to move to something different. You really
Mhm.
kind of get stuck on a road and you have a hard time choosing a different path. That is combined with excessive expectations, having infeasible goals that are beyond what other people might find reasonable. I think either of those two alone are probably not a disaster. But when you put them together, it creates a really bad set of ingredients that really interact in a way that cause problems. Because what it does is it creates a path forward for things that are basically unattainable and frustrating, and you have a hard time when you recognize that being able to shift to a new strategy. And so you've probably
Mhm.
seen some of these folks in the workplace where they have this idea of what needs to happen and they hesitate or are reluctant to switch gears. And really, the goal is probably never going to be able to be achieved. And so it's really this lack of flexibility and adaptability. And I think that's different than high standards. High standards are great to hold for oneself as long as you're flexible around them and as long as they're reasonable. They can be excessive in that they're way beyond what uh, they could be excessive in that they are extreme, but they are still
Mhm.
relatively attainable, and you're flexible in what happens when you don't quite reach them. Right? This is the difference between someone who is expecting perfect scores on tests and then misses one item and is okay, right? They think, oh, like I did amazing anyway. That one point, I'm not thrilled about it, but it didn't really have this huge effect on the outcome. Whereas someone with perfectionism might never be satisfied with scoring a 99th percentile, and they will keep
Mhm.
pushing until they get that 100th percentile.
It's actually really interesting because I just saw the other day on LinkedIn there were one of the big tech companies was recruiting and they made a post and part of their mantra was basically progress over perfection.
Mhm.
And it seems to me that a lot of the companies will value that sort of mindset of, you'll make some mistakes, but those other characteristics of working hard, of being conscientious and so forth, those are things that they will value, of course, highly rather than getting everything right and having this almost compulsive need to ensure that everything is a 10 out of 10.
I'm glad you used the word compulsive because that's you can see how it connects to the obsessive compulsive spectrum. Absolutely. So, they say that perfectionism is the enemy of the good, meaning people that get stuck on perfection and trying to achieve
Mm-hmm.
perfection, they get paralyzed on the process. They get paralyzed trying to optimize both the process and the product. And in doing so, here's the irony of it. I call it the irony problem. They end up not
Mm-hmm.
getting it done at all, or
Right.
they end up destroying it. One of my own personal journeys that I was talking about earlier was recognizing this when I was a child. I was drawing a picture of Spider-Man. Is Marvel Studios a sponsor of your podcast? Maybe I should be more thoughtful.
Not well,
Uh,
maybe we'll speak to them next time we can get them to
yeah,
sponsor the
right.
podcast.
So a superhero who will remain nameless. I was drawing his character, and basically as a kid, and I was trying to get the webbing just right, and that's a common feature of perfectionism is this feeling that we call just right. In fact, we have a very clever name for this in the field. We call it not just right feelings. And so it's basically I was trying to get the webbing just right, and there's a specific geometry or pattern to it if you've ever seen the Spider-Man's costume.
Mhm,
And I just kept erasing and erasing and to the point where I was creating rips in the paper. I had destroyed the drawing in general.
mhm.
Spider-Man looked like he had spaghetti arms by the time I was done. The idea is that I was trying to get this thing so perfect that I ended up destroying it in the process. And that's why I
Mhm.
call it the irony problem, because either it never gets done in the first place, I get so paralyzed that I never finish, or I've destroyed the product. And in the end, the product that was 80% good enough was probably the best it was going to get in the first place. Or
Right.
maybe I would have sacrificed a million things in my life to have worked on this. And that's the other issue is, sure, you could keep pushing this, but what is the opportunity cost of trying to get that extra, 5, 10%?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, then if we go further into your book, you note that perfectionists have the traits of honesty and conscientiousness. Many of them do. But let's say individuals who want to reduce this perfectionist aspect without compromising on these positive qualities, how would they go about doing this? Is there a set pathway they can take, or what does
Yeah.
that look like?
Yeah, well, I mean, you don't have to sacrifice those qualities. And the best part that I'd like to advertise is that you don't really need to sacrifice the quality of your work. Right? People, that's the biggest thing I hear when I talk to organizations and I speak to teams, and
Hmm.
that is the number one thing I get is, well, I don't want to sacrifice the quality of my work by addressing this. I think it's useful. And sure, if I nuke a fly, it's going to kill the fly, but what is the collateral damage, right? And
Hmm.
so can
Hmm.
you be a little bit more precise in how you attack that fly rather than destroying several city blocks in the process? And so
Yeah.
I often tell people that there are ways of doing this without sacrificing the good qualities or the qualities of the work that you do. And it starts with buying at least 23 versions of my book to read. No, it starts with understanding the concept of perfectionism and then challenging some of its core features. One of them is this fear of failure and this
Oh yeah.
fear of being judged, which links to this fear of failure. And the best way in our field, the most evidence way of fighting this is to do what's called exposure-based exercises or approach-based
Hmm.
exercises. And what I often have people do when I work with people, either in the clinical setting or in the work setting, is teach people to sit with the discomfort of potentially making mistakes or having mistakes that are potentially problematic or catastrophic.
Hmm.
And so I will actually tell people to make mistakes on purpose in a systematic and collaborative way. And what I mean by that is I won't just force them, I never force anyone to do this stuff, to go make really egregious mistakes, but instead we will build on really tiny mistakes and
Hmm.
sit with the anxiety about what that means for them or what that means for their future. So this could be something simple from our perspective, but from a perfectionist perspective, it is extremely concerning and catastrophic. And so they might
Hmm.
be things like a typo in an email to their boss, or maybe sending your email to Jim customer A instead of Jim customer B on accident, right?
Right.
Or the thing that I've never done is to forget to attach the attachment when I send an email, right? Never done that before in
I'm
my life.
included in that one.
Yeah, never. I
Never
don't
done that
know
problem.
what kind of fools do that, right? No, I think these are like little things that we might do from our perspective. It happens daily, but from a perfectionist perspective, they're really freaking out about the potential consequences. And even more
Mm.
importantly, most of the time is that they're freaking out that they can't handle the anxiety, right? They
Right.
actually are afraid of their fear. And so they will do all sorts of behaviors to try to avoid that scenario, things that I call safety behaviors. Safety
Hmm.
behaviors are things like escape, avoidance, procrastination, which is probably the number one thing I see in perfectionism. Seeking a ton of reassurance from people. How's this look? Is
Right.
this okay? Is this the right way? Just not even absenteeism, calling in sick, not getting things done, missing deadlines. These are all classic consequences of safety behaviors. And
Interesting.
that's the other thing then I will attack when I'm working with organizations and people is how do we put a dent in stopping those behaviors? How can we get you to meet a deadline even if the work is subpar or you think is subpar?
Hmm.
How do we stop you from seeking so much reassurance and sitting with the possibility that you did something incorrectly, right?
Yeah.
How do we get you to stop checking and fixing over and over and over again? And you just maybe you get a boundary. You have one fix or one reread, and then you have to send it. Or maybe you can only look this over for 5 more minutes and then you send it. And so you set these boundaries on these safety behaviors. So that's also what we do. So we make mistakes on purpose. We set some boundaries on these safety behaviors, and then we also engage in a lot of cognitive work. Let's think about
Hmm.
how it is that you're catastrophizing this, why it is that you think you can't handle the anxiety, and start to help them loosen their cognitions around this, their thinking patterns and beliefs, because that tends to get them really stuck like quicksand. And working with them on it can be crucial. Now, that's all at the individual level. I will go into
Hmm.
organizations and I will work with them from the top down because I think just as important is the culture that the company has. And this is why the book was originally written was less about the individual, which I provide plenty of the bottom up solutions, but the top down solutions are how does your company, how does your division, how do your teams experience the culture in the workplace? Do they expect perfection? Do they expect that your product needs to be perfect? Does your team mentality expect mistakes not to be okay and to sort of pull the rug over them? Does it provide an incentive system that might say one thing on and then but have a different mentality or a different message on the other end where we're incentivizing perfection or we're expecting you to not make mistakes. And so that kind of culture is something that needs to be addressed. A culture in which
Hmm.
making mistakes is actually welcomed as long as they're strategic and intelligent mistakes where you are learning from it and taking good risks because not there's nothing quite like stifling creativity and innovation like perfectionism. The research is
Hmm.
clear. Creativity and perfectionism do not go together.
That's so interesting. And I think one of the things you mentioned now that really made me connect the dots was the fact of people who are perfectionists are afraid of making mistakes. And I never really connected those two that well together, but I've worked with a lot of people who are afraid of making mistakes by nature. And I've always noticed that they do, as you said, they procrastinate a lot. They take a lot of time to get things done. But for some reason, I didn't associate that to perfectionism. But you're basically saying that these two actually do go hand in hand. That in fact, the reason they are afraid of making mistakes is because it just has to be perfect and that there can't be mistakes because it will be the end of their career or who knows what else?
Fear, failure, and perfectionism go together like Batman and Robin. There you go. A DC reference to balance out the Marvel reference. Now you got to get both
Indeed.
sponsors.
Now they'll be happy. They'll be happy about that one.
Right. No, they go together tremendously. Now, it's not, they're not synonymous. Not everyone with perfectionism really has a robust fear of failure, but by and large, when you see one, you see the other. And it usually is the driving force behind perfectionism is this fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of doing something incorrectly, fear of being morally bad or incorrect, which is a part of sort
Mhm.
of this fear of failure. I mean, there's this element of moral perfectionism where people have to be good, and so they're constantly seeking reassurance about whether they're being good, whether they're being, moral, whether they're doing things that are wrong. And so this
Sure.
form of perfectionism can get really paralyzing for people as well.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. You mentioned from a company's perspective too, and how you deal with companies. Now, I'm sure there's a lot of organizations that may create an environment that's not exactly conducive for people to be creative, and where, let's say, this fear of failure becomes actually enlarged due to the way they run the company. So, and I'm sure a lot of our MBAs out there are managers or even senior managers at this point and perhaps may want to avoid that situation at their organization. So, what would you say are some barriers that you usually try to resolve with companies when it comes to perfectionism? And can you give some examples of where some of these hinders that a company has had have been kind of removed through some fairly simple exercises or change of mindsets?
Yeah, so there are some simple exercises I provide in the book that lean into this idea of exposure and making mistakes, about going about a process because people get stuck on the process, right? How do I optimize this process? What order of operations do I select? Do I do it in the perfect order, or am I going to be inefficient? And these kinds of, did I select the right strategy for approaching this? And so part of it is just having people approach tasks with a mentality of, could be the right strategy, could be the wrong strategy, and let's see what happens. And sitting with that anxiety as an exposure exercise. It's about prioritization. I have a framework that I talk in the book called the emphasis framework, which really
Mm-hmm.
has three emphasis approaches or effort allocations. One is emphasis A. This means to do it with your all, with everything you got, 110%.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's emphasis B, which is the get it done, get her done, right? Doesn't need to be perfect, doesn't need to be garbage, just kind of good enough, right? Like get it
Mm-hmm.
done. And then there's emphasis C, which is not to do it at all. And you might think that I have a judgment about what's good or bad about each of those, but actually I'm agnostic
Mm-hmm.
to that. There's a time and place for all three of them. Emphasis A makes a lot of sense for a lot of things in life. Let's say you're planning your wedding and it's a very valuable thing to you and your family. So you emphasis A that. It's based on your values, what's important to you. And then you might even choose to emphasis C a few things. There are a lot of things in
Mm-hmm.
life that are just not worth your time based on your values. I never answer those customer satisfaction surveys at the end of the call. And I'm sorry for anybody that, that's they're in charge of that, but it's just not something that I feel is valuable to me. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, there's no greater feeling than being able to recognize in advance that that is an emphasis C task, and I feel good about not doing that because it's not consistent with my values. It's extremely
Mm-hmm.
liberating because most people who are perfectionists feel like they have to do every task in front of them. And the guilt that comes with not doing things is profound. But when you start to use a different mentality like this emphasis framework, it really can be freeing. And emphasis B is really what most things in life warrant, to be honest with you. And the problem with perfectionism is quite clear to me and has been for decades, is that everyone with perfectionism tries to emphasis A too many things, if not everything.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens is that because that's impossible, it's infeasible, things go from emphasis A and are forced into an emphasis C. So things just don't get done. They get procrastinated. They just never get done. They miss deadlines. And it's not because of a strategy or a value. Like I didn't choose emphasis C for that task for value based on my values. I chose it because my
Right.
perfectionism forced it on me. And so it's a strategy where your perfectionism is dictating your values and activities rather than your actual values and what's important to you. And so part of what we do in a work setting and also with clients in the therapy room is try to define their values and then to help them use those values as guideposts for how to allocate their effort for these tasks and to switch
Mhm.
the ratio. Most things in life, emphasis B, sometimes a little emphasis C, sometimes a little dabbling of emphasis A. People with perfectionism, the ratio is not the same. And so our goal is to move them more towards a healthy ratio.
Right. Okay. Well, that's very good. And what about then the people who are in teams working with perfectionists? On the other side, let's say, because I've known people who say that work with perfectionists and sort of difficulties it creates, and there's a sometimes arguments and problems, unnecessary problems that are created in a workplace. If you are, let's say, in a team right now and you have a perfectionist and it's causing you headaches and whatever, what can you do as that person at this
Slide my book under the door in an anonymous way. I uh
time?
no, I really I think that the answer is to check in first with yourself is it depends on where you are in the team. Are you the leader? If you're the leader and you have some influence over the culture or the climate, ask yourself how is it that you might be contributing to that mentality because it's very difficult for your employees to escape that tendency if their boss is doing the same thing and sort of locked into that mindset. So check in with yourself about what you can do about the culture of the team or the organization to loosen it up, promote flexibility, promote good enough and emphasis B work for things that just need to get done, and then emphasis A for the things that are really critical to the organization. And then I think it's important for you to take a look at which employees might be really struggling with this and ask yourself, do they have any insight into this? Do they know that
Mhm.
they're struggling with this? Is this something that they see? And if not, that's where you need to start because it's very difficult to work on something if with them if they don't even understand that it's a problem. If they've got insight or you've built that insight, then you can start to work with them on strategies like shifting their effort allocation or doing some of that purposeful mistake making exercises or reducing the safety behaviors. That's where you could come in quite a lot as a coworker or as a supervisor, so that you can resist those safety behaviors that tend to rope people in, like reassurance seeking. So if this person keeps coming to you, you're the boss, and they say, "Does this look all right?" Is it, and it's becoming draining and resource intensive and they've asked you 1,000 different times in 1,000 different
Mhm.
ways. They've asked you to relook things over and over again.
Mhm.
That's where you can step in and say, I'm setting a boundary here. I know that this is anxiety provoking for you, but let's say that you can only ask me this once, and then the rest of it, you're going to have to sit with the anxiety that maybe it's not correct, right? And sort of setting that boundary. And we call that in the field family accommodation prevention. It comes from the anxiety world, and it's not just for
Mhm.
family. If family is inclusive in this case, it's coworkers and spiritual leaders and coaches and spouses and parents. I mean, it's everyone in that person's world that they get sucked into these safety behaviors, right?
Mhm.
And so that is where the environment can say no and establish some guidelines around how to handle that when you have a perfectionistic employee.
I wish I knew that some time ago because the boundaries aspect actually seems a little counterintuitive at times, where you would say, actually, this person needs the help. So you need to
Mhm.
give them extra attention. And, they're not delivering perhaps as much as you'd like to. So you're spending even more time. And that seems to lead to them wanting even more time to make sure that, they get everything right. And basically what you're saying is go with the counterintuitive pathway where
Yeah.
you say, let's create some boundaries and say, look, I will help you to a certain extent, but that's about it. Then you're on your own and you need to send it out in 5 minutes, not in 2 hours, if it's an email or
Yep.
proposal or whatever it does.
Yep. And I think that it is absolutely counterintuitive and it makes people very uncomfortable. We feel, I think in society in general, we want to be able to reassure people, we want we want to give them that temporary relief, that little boost of relief. The problem is it's
Yeah.
extremely reinforcing, right? So what
Mm-hmm.
happens, and we call it the sawtooth effect in my field, and I talk about this in chapter 5, is this idea that every time you give into that, anytime somebody does a safety behavior or enables a safety behavior, right?
Hmm.
What it does is it reinforces that temporary relief, but it doesn't solve the underlying problem. And so it just increases the likelihood that they do that same behavior or something like it again in the future. And so it creates this growing problem that never quite goes away and continues to worsen unless you start to set boundaries around it and not reinforce that behavior. Now, here's the thing, right? I'm not suggesting you do this in a non-compassionate, jerky way, right? I'm suggesting that you bring the person that's struggling with this into the conversation. You have them collaborate with you. You have them understand that you're not resisting the reassurance because you're annoyed or because you're a bad boss or because you're a jerk. It's because you're worried about this person's perfectionism and their anxiety, and you want to help them become more productive and to
Hmm.
overcome this fear of making mistakes. And so it's not your job as a supervisor to be a therapist, but you essentially can create an environment where you are reinforcing the opposite of what's causing the problems, which is go make these mistakes, potential mistakes, and sit with the potential consequences. I'm not going to feed into this pattern that's going to continue to have you grow in your seeking of reassurance and
Hmm.
safety.
Hmm. No, incredibly helpful, and it's so interesting because I think that's something that I've run into with people I've worked with in the past. So definitely taking that into account. You've highlighted before, Greg, that perfectionism exists on a spectrum.
Mhm.
So where are some early warning signs that someone's perfectionism might be reaching a problematic or even diagnosable level?
If it's a diagnosable level, I think it becomes more obvious because it's all on a spectrum. The answer is always distress and impairment. In my field, if you want to know where to draw the line on when someone really could benefit from some therapy, it's distress and impairment. How much distress is it
Hmm.
causing, and how much impairment is it causing? And it's not just to oneself, but to the people around you, right? Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of tools and strategies you can use before that point. And so that's the point of the book. It's not meant just for people that reach these clinical levels. If it does reach those clinical levels, it might behoove the individual to go get the proper therapy. You're going to need a much more guided, structured, and sort of supportive environment for doing this in a structured way.
Hmm.
Whereas before that, this is more of an optimization idea, right? Like, how can we optimize the workplace? How can we optimize people's productivity? How can we optimize people's creativity and innovation? And
Hmm.
I think that there's room for that at the earliest levels, at the lowest levels of perfectionism, where you see just a little bit of people getting stuck or procrastinating even just a touch, or worrying excessively about performance and getting stuck on feeling micromanaged or feeling like they don't have autonomy where they can then make mistakes and create and essentially make the call in terms of how they approach a task. I think the more
Hmm.
controlled an environment, the more micromanaged it feels, the more scripted and structured it feels in that sense. I think people are going to be more on alert about deviating from that and being in trouble.
Mm, mm. No, very interesting. In fact, I wanted to ask you before I move on to the next question as well, where do some of these traits actually stem from? Is that something that people get early on in their childhood that they learn, or is it a genetic thing? What's usually the cause for this?
As a psychologist, you probably expect me to say it's all the mom's fault, but it's not. It's not all the mom. I echo that. It is not all the mom's fault. So it's really a mixture of environment and nurture. It's nature and nurture. And anyone that tells you it's either one or the other in any domain of human behavior is being overly simplistic. It's a
Right.
mishmash of both. It's really at the biological level we see a lot of this inherited, and it's mostly in my mind a inheritance of neuroticism or this anxiety based trait that's underlying
Hmm.
our personalities. Some people have higher levels of this neuroticism, other people don't, and it's on a spectrum. And I think that that is probably the genetic piece that's carried on. And then I think the perfectionism kind of takes shape from the environment. And it could be from parents, it could be from the schools, it could be from culture in general. It could be, there's a lot of what we call socially prescribed perfectionism, where
Hmm.
the standards don't come from within us. They come from outside of us and are projected and exerted on us. Classic example of this is, females feeling that their body isn't sufficient because of what they're seeing in models on magazines and on the internet. And
Right.
so that's a socially prescribed version of perfectionism versus self-prescribed or self-oriented, where we've created those standards ourselves in our mind and held ourselves accountable. And then there's
Hmm.
other oriented where we create these standards, but then we project them onto other people, right?
Right.
So there's these three different types. And I think that those take shape in conjunction with the underlying genetic component, but I don't know that there's a single answer for any given individual. I think there's a mishmash, a mix of both that are at play.
Right. Right. Okay, that's very interesting. Of course, it then loops back to what you were saying, that if you're working in an organization and you're the boss of a particular person or in a team with a particular person who has this perfectionism aspect to them, that you don't want to reinforce that sort of behavior. You want to create the barriers so that it reduces and hopefully diminishes completely. So that all makes sense.
Absolutely. So if you are a part of a team that's manufacturing something or trying to achieve a project, trying to roll out some new product, and you roll it out, and as the boss, you come in and you're demoralized by the sort of performance, the reception it receives, even though it's done really well and has gotten praise and the CEO is excited and the public offerings are huge and whatever it is,
Hmm.
and you come in and you're kind of a Eeyore in the team room, and you're just like, we could have done better. The classic sort of nothing is good enough
Mm,
mentality, that we can't take a step back and appreciate the good stuff that we've accomplished. That is a modeling that I think is detrimental to the team.
right. Right. And would you say many CEOs have this personality trait, or is that a misconception?
I get that question. That's the second question I get the most. The first is, does it sacrifice the quality of my work? But whenever I speak to organizations, the next question is, where do you see this in organizations? Is it at the very top? And
Mm,
I find that CEOs actually tend to have less of this trait. The successful
right.
CEOs tend to have less of this trait because in order to be a successful CEO, you need to be flexible. You need to fail forward, as they say. You need to learn from your
Hmm.
mistakes. You need to fail quickly and often in order to really arrive at what you want or need in a product or in a success. That being said, I do work with plenty of CEOs that struggle with this, but I do think that the successful ones probably have overcome that or don't have a lot of it to begin with. I do think that I see an absolute drowning amount of it just a step below that in the C-suite, right? So if you ever wonder
Right.
why some people don't quite ever make it to that CEO level, that like top,
Yeah.
it's because I think that that's the quality that they might be missing, right? So if you're a listener and you're aspiring to be a CEO and not just create your own organization, but rise above on the ranks of a Fortune 500, so to speak, I think one of the biggest obstacles is that this mentality and this
Hmm.
approach of being fearless when it comes to making intelligent mistakes and learning from them. Because at that level right below, the CFO, the CTOs, the chief operating officers, the chief people, whatever, right? So that you get these people that become rigid about
Hmm.
protocols and meeting expectations and rules driven rather than principle driven and getting stuck on
Hmm.
that. And so you get this interesting mix of people at that level that I think really can then trickle down into the culture. Even if the CEO has a non-perfectionistic approach to the world, the team that they've
Right.
assembled underneath them is really what matters. And so everything trickles down. And so if your C-suite has that flexible, autonomous, let's lean into mistakes and take intelligent risk mentality instead of micromanaging and being controlling and following rules instead of principles, those that all sort of rains down on the organization.
Wow. Okay. That's actually quite useful to know, because even if the CEO has that sort of flexible approach, you can still be very rigid because of the other people who sit in the C-suites. And I guess a lot of organizations probably don't even think about that.
I don't think they think about it. And to be fair, I think you need a little bit of everyone on your team. I'm a big fan of diversity on a team, and I mean diversity in
Right.
the most global sense possible, not just in terms of identity, but in terms of things like detailed orientedness versus big picture thinkers. And so I don't, please make, please do not infer from this conversation that perfectionists are not good for the workplace. I do not, this is not a witch
Mhm.
hunt for getting rid of perfectionists. Perfectionists can really benefit from some strategies for not getting stuck, but they also bring
Mhm.
tremendous strengths to the team. And you need them on your team to balance out some of those big picture thinkers that are sometimes too loose in their thinking
Mhm.
and not following certain protocols that can get them into trouble. So you really need that balance. I just find when you get into the C-suite, the balance is a little bit off sometimes, and it's a little bit more
Right.
about the rigidity rather than the fluidity. I don't necessarily see that as much at the CEO level, but I see it one step below. And then, of course, as you move down the
Very.
ranks into middle management, it becomes much more heterogeneous, but a lot of middle management can be pretty rigid. And so, creating a middle management sort of approach where you're focusing more on principles rather than rules and allowing people
Mhm.
autonomy and freedom to do the stuff that they need to do to get good work done, that is where you'll see the most traction in your workplace.
Excellent. Excellent. So that's a good takeaway, actually, to look for that balance between the different people and their mindsets and so forth. And it seems to me, from what you're telling me, that actually what the problem is that there isn't a balance at many organizations. And that's where perhaps some of the problems actually stem from.
It's the
Um,
balance, and then it's the culture that's raining down from the top, right?
yeah.
There are ways of creating a Goldilocks culture that is constantly needing attention and tweaking, but you can get that to that sort of Goldilocks zone where people
Mm,
have a balance of these fluid expectations that are not perfectionistic, but still, expect quality.
yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. You mentioned that perfectionists can be some of the most reliable employees. So, what are some ways to spot a perfectionist in the workplace, and how can managers best support these employees to thrive?
Yeah, so I do. I think that perfectionists can be the most hardworking and some of the most reliable as long as the safety behaviors and the anxiety are not causing them to miss deadlines and procrastinate. So that would be what
Hmm.
I'd be looking for as a red flag in any worker is look out
Hmm.
for these safety behaviors. Look out for
Yeah.
somebody that's not meeting deadlines, even though their work is superb, right? So that's how I will recognize someone almost immediately. Their work is like unbelievably unparalleled in terms of its quality, but it comes in late, right? And so you're thinking,
Hmm.
well, that's interesting. And if this is a continued pattern, my suggestion is that you draw a hypothesis that there's some perfectionism going on, and if so, you can have a delicate conversation about that with your employee and figure out ways of supporting them in getting that stuff done without getting stuck on meeting deadlines and not being fast enough, because perfectionist can cause a tremendous bottleneck in the workflow in your workplace, right? It's like
Hmm.
in the book, I use the example of being behind the slow golfers on the miniature golf course. You're just sort of waiting for them to kind of, you could play through, you like go around
Hmm.
them, but then you're missing a hole, right? And so it's you can talk to them nicely and try to speed them up. So it really is a bottleneck. And so approaching these folks and doing so in a collaborative, gentle way. And I think that is one of the red flags is sort of this great work, just late,
Yeah.
right? And so working with them on that. Another sort of indicator is somebody that's constantly seeking reassurance from you in different ways. And sometimes it's even a little subtle, like fishing for reassurance, right? They're kind of putting it out there to see what you think, or even looking at micro facial expressions, right? And you can
Sure.
have that talk with them too. If you're finding that they're really distressed and they're constantly coming to you for this reassurance, then it's time to sit down. So I think again, working on those safety behaviors, helping them with that fear of anxiety, fear of failure, and the anxiety.
Hmm.
Once you catch those, then I think you can really help clear those and help mitigate those. And then that reliability, that loyalty, and that honesty, that hard work, that attention to detail, all of it can be leveraged for good for the organization.
Yeah. Yeah. No, makes sense. I want to loop in some of the questions that come in from our members because one of the
Okay.
things we did, Greg, is we asked before we did the podcast, we asked our community if they had any questions for you specifically.
Great.
So I have a couple of questions here. The first one is from Reed from Nottingham Trent, who says, "I believe I'm a perfectionist. I'm very high achieving, critical, pay enormously close attention to details. My question is, how can this weakness be turned into a strength?"
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I think we've really touched on some of it already, which is identify the areas that are slowing you down. First of all, perfectionism is a mixed bag. So please don't consider that a tremendous detriment with no strengths attached to it. So the bottom line is that you want to mitigate the damaging qualities and promote or foster the good qualities. You, as a perfectionist, have potential or already provide tremendous value to the organizations that you are a part of. And so I would suggest that you take stock in where are you slowing down? Where are you causing tremendous difficulties for the people around you? Where are you causing difficulties for yourself in terms of your emotional health, your functioning, and prioritize? It could be very overwhelming to kind of list all of these things and then freak out about all the things that you might need to work on, but pick a couple that you think are causing some of the most damage and try to work on it using some of the things that we've talked about today. If you're, make mistakes on purpose, start to work on some of your thinking. In the book, I talk a lot about how to engage socially with people. If some of those, if you're projecting some of those standards onto other people, that can create a pretty toxic work environment. I talk about goal setting and I talk about how to focus on principles rather than rules, which is something that I think is critical for a healthier balance in lifestyle. And I really do believe that you can move towards a healthier approach without sacrificing some of the good stuff that's been described. And so I think it's a mixed bag. I wouldn't be so down on myself for being perfectionist. Instead, I would try to reduce some of the damage that might come from that and move towards leveraging some of the strengths.
Very good. Very good. The second question, which you've kind of touched on already, but it's quite interesting. I don't have the person's name, but they say, "I consider myself a perfectionist to a large extent and find it very difficult to work in a team. Sometimes I can see a teammate's potential, but struggle to understand why they would not want to do their best in the task assigned. Is the solution to compromise on the project? I aim to become a manager one day, and I would like to work on this personality trait of mine."
Yeah, glad this was brought up. This goes back to the other oriented perfectionism that I was talking about. People with perfectionism often have a degree of other oriented perfectionism that could cause them to feel resentment and frustration, demoralization, you name it. It gets
Mhm.
particularly toxic when it becomes moral. So I call it other oriented moralism, where you hold other people to really rigid moral standards, right? The person on your team that shows up at 7:02 instead of 7, the time to get at work, quote unquote, is 7 a.m. And the person with other oriented moralism might even say something or snicker or roll their eyes or get frustrated. This is the kind of thing that I think causes a toxic workplace because it sort of assumes that the perfectionist is the police officer, right? They're policing everything and it's not necessarily their.
Right.
It also gets fixated on rules rather than principles. In that case, the rule is to be at work at 7 a.m. The principle is be on time, right?
Mhm.
Be punctual. And, you know, principles are never met. They're an ongoing thing where you either show fidelity towards it or fidelity not towards it. And whereas rules can be met or not met. And the problem is somebody who's a perfectionist is an all or none thinker. They tend to think that something is all there or not all there, good or all bad, black or all white. And so if someone misses a deadline or is a 7:02, they show up to work, they treat this principle as if it were a rule. Well, this person is not punctual. Even though that person might have been on time every day for the last 3 years, it sort of creates this all or none approach where the person then feels like the other oriented perfectionist feels like this person's not doing their end of the deal or meeting their end of the bargain. And so it really becomes this really difficult environment for other people to work in. And so I would strongly encourage anyone that struggles with this to focus on how they are projecting out to other people, the behavior that they're engaging in that might be costing them social capital with the people around them and asking themselves, am I being overly or hyper focused on rules at the expense of the principle? right? I give a
Mm.
really stupid example of this just to really drive home what I mean by principles and rules. Imagine you're at a community pool, right? And there's a kid drowning in the deep end, and no one else notices. And it's up to you. The lifeguards, probably on Snapchat and right, or listening to an AMBA podcast. And
Even
and
better.
even better, right? And so you notice and you're like, okay, I could go save this kid, but I just ate within 30 minutes. And the rules on the pool sign say I can't go in the pool within 30 minutes,
Mm.
right? And so you just stand there and let the kid drown. Maybe you have tried to get someone else to go in. What's the point of that rule? Well, the rule is there. The principle underlying it is public safety. We don't want people puking in the pool, right?
Yeah.
But what you just undermined that principle by allowing this kid to drown,
Hmm. Right.
right? So that is you abiding by a rule so rigidly that it undermined the actual principle. And that's what I
Right.
mean. And I know it's a ridiculously stupid example because very few people would let a kid drown, but I think it's something that you could see in the workplace on a smaller scale time and time again, where somebody is focusing so much on the rule that they forgot it sort of undermines the underlying principle that
I
drives.
think I think Arnold Schwarzenegger said something similar to that. I mean, he said something about, you know, don't be afraid to break rules, just don't break your principle,
Yeah.
and which is really interesting. So I think your point actually does make a lot of sense in that regard.
Are you saying that Arnold Schwarzenegger got there before I did? I think that's
Who knows? But in any
that's
case,
that's great. No, Arnold Schwarzenegger is, if he said that, is right on the money. I do think that sometimes we get stuck on the rules. And so if this
yeah.
person is struggling with that other oriented moralism or other oriented perfectionism, I would sort of take a step back, ask themselves about rules versus principles, try to figure out social capital and how it is that you're sort of being perceived by others, and learning some strategies for
Mm.
challenging that tendency to intervene and to make your opinion heard. I'm not a huge fan of integrating memes as wisdom into my life, but there's one
Right.
meme that I saw where I was like, this makes a lot of sense. I might have to integrate this one. It's the all unsolicited advice is perceived as criticism.
Right.
And this idea of, and when you say that to a room, half the people are like, oh, yeah, totally. Super judgmental. I feel criticized. The other half is like, what do you mean? I'm just trying to help. If I'm not going to be the one to
Yeah.
tell you,
Yeah.
who is? Right. So it's
Yeah.
this really interesting bifurcation in the population. But really, I do believe that that's true. Anytime you get
Yeah.
unsolicited advice, it feels like someone's being critical of you.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. And I've been in those shoes myself. I know exactly what that feels like. Uh,
Yeah.
one last question,
Sure.
because I can see we're running out of time. Uh, the person here is asking, why is perfectionism always considered so bad? Could it not be a boost to ensure efficiency and effectiveness?
It is not all bad, as we've talked about in this. I think that it comes with a lot of positive qualities. But I got to tell you, efficiency and quality generally are not. So quality maybe, but at what expense, right? So
Mm,
the quality is gonna, you might get something done beautifully, but did it cost you sleep? Did it cause you relationships? Did it cause you to sacrifice all these important things in your life? Remember,
mhm.
you might have gotten amazing quality because you emphasis aid this thing, but what did it cost you? How many things were emphasis seed as a result of
Yeah,
it? Right. So quality is a separate issue, but efficiency, I've never met a perfectionist who's particularly efficient. Right.
yeah,
In fact, I would say that that is a contradictory concept, is that almost by nature, a perfectionist is inefficient. They're slow. They try to find optimal processes. They get stuck. They're seeking reassurance. They get mired in these safety
mhm.
behaviors. If you're wanting efficiency, you're going to want somebody that's flexible, and you're going to want it so that they're not less necessarily have low standards. So high standards plus flexibility is what you're looking for, not
Yeah,
perfectionism.
yeah, yeah. No, very well said, Greg. Well, what we'll do is actually we will send out this podcast to everyone and actually a link to your book as well, where they can actually follow on and read much of this in much more detail. And I think regardless of where you are on that pattern, whether you are someone who maybe feels that you're a perfectionist or someone who works with perfectionists, I think the most interesting takeaway is to find that balance, working on, some of those perhaps borders that you were discussing earlier, where you don't reinforce some of the behaviors that they have, but really stress the fact that, things have to be sometimes not 100% perfect. And things have, but so long as they get done. And I think people on both sides will find this really, really useful. So thank you very much for providing all this insight, Greg.
My pleasure. And I do believe that your organization is linking to the book, which will have a discount.
Indeed.
And I do believe that so you'll be able to get it at a cheaper cost. And if you're needing more assistance, a book is great. But if you're needing more assistance, I'm happy to talk about how I could help out your organization. I'm also in the midst of creating a community that provides education, services, support for helping people find the balance that you're describing, that wellness, but productivity without sacrificing quality by cutting through some of this difficulty. And so if that's something that you have an interest in, please reach out.
Fantastic. So what we'll do is we'll give the link to the book with a discount, and we'll have your contact details too, Greg, so that people have questions or would like to seek your guidance or your services, they can do so directly. And I think that's, I mean, as helpful for individuals as it is for organizations. So
Love it.
regardless of where you are, I mean, they can get in touch with you.
Appreciate it. I love to hear from people. So let me know what you thought of the podcast. Let me know what you think of the concept. Even if today was imperfect, I appreciate hearing about people's thoughts.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Greg. And thank you, everyone, for listening to this podcast. We'll be back in a couple of months with some more very juicy content. So stay tuned. And in the meantime, if you are interested, just check our events page for any other upcoming webinars that we do. And feel free to register for those. Thank you once again, Greg, and take care.
Take care.